Hey, welcome back to BIBSTER'S Repair Shop. It's time for a What's the Deal with video. As you guys know, this is a series we started months and months ago and haven't done one for a little bit of time. Two reasons. Mostly, if you guys have noticed, I haven't had too much content last couple weeks, and we'll get to a video about all of that. I haven't even talked about the video about we bought a van like 3 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago now. Anyway, we'll get to that video about the van. But the big news was that almost 4 weeks ago, by the time this uploads, on the September 23rd, Glenn David Jackson entered the world. We'll throw a quick picture of him somewhere here. Anyway, Mrs. Bibster and I will do an entire video on that fun story because it's quite a story. You guys all like it. But because of that, I haven't been out here very often. I'm only out here right now. It's like 11 o'clock because they're both sleeping currently. So while they're sleeping real quick, I snuck out here because while I've been home more and not been out in the garage getting ready for next season already. My fuel off? Feels like my fuel's on. Speaking of fuel, we're going to talk about what's the deal with fuel. Now, today's video, first off, we're going to just put a big disclaimer here. Remember, I know some of you might be new to the channel. We really appreciate that. But remember, I'm an idiot. So I will say things talking out of my foot. I will say stats that are probably wrong. But generally, this is the story of tractor fuels. So we're going to pretty much go up to diesel. We won't get into diesel too much, but we're going to go through why we burn what we burn, why this one would have technically run on a different kind of fuel than it did now when it was originally from the factory, and why they did that. So we'll go way back to get in the old Wayback Machine, set that thing on turn of the century. Turn of the century, most tractors, pretty sure it was all of them, not most, but anyway, first things that were burning were steam powered. And steam powered tractors basically were just a boiler that heated up water that used that steam pressure to move a piston, that moved the tire, that moved a set of gears, that moved a belt, and moved tires and all that stuff. Well, the advantage with those was they could burn anything that was combustible. And the stories and the history of it is they would. You know, they would throw wood, coal, paper, they were out, hay, straw, anything that was combustible, they could burn. And that was the advantage with them, You didn't have to, go down to your local 7-Eleven and fill up the steam tractor. I mean, you had to put water in it. But, you could burn anything. So whatever you were in the world, if coal was accessible, you'd use that. If coal wasn't, you'd use wood. So that was where they could burn anything. It was nice. But obviously, the fun and the sun of having to start your tractor 3 hours before you wanted to do anything kind of wore out. So some of these early prairie brushing tractors in the 1910s-ish era started running gasoline engines. Well, because there was already gasoline at that point, but gasoline was very expensive. And we'll talk about kind of that why. And so a lot of the early tractors run on kerosene. And so here's where the first bit of Bibster science comes in. So gasoline was way more expensive at the time than kerosene. So most of these tractors are on kerosene. The problem with kerosene is, and if you guys have ever been around a kerosene heater, it's a lot thicker than gas, and it also basically science time. So all fuels are hydrocarbons, and you start off with a barrel of crude oil that you pump out of the ground, and in that's all of these hydrocarbons that are strung together, and depending on what variety they are, they come out of that at different heats. So in the time period, at that point, all they would do is they would heat up that oil, and it was just like, when you watch the old show on Discovery, Moonshiners, there's like a big still, and they would heat it up, and at a certain temperature, one gas would boil off, and another temperature, another gas would boil off. So that's how they got, that kind of fuel. So, but gasoline is like a C, again, don't quote me on this, it's like a C, like 4 to C8 or 10 or something like that. And then kerosene is like C8 to C16. Basically, the less, it takes more heat to get the kerosene out, which also means when it burns, it can be cheaper to produce, which is good, but it also means that it takes a lot more heat to run. So here's kind of the numbers. gasoline will basically, it'll burn down to like, it'll like flash off or evaporate, which is what you want it to do to burn, is to, you know, become a vapor, because if it's a liquid, it won't burn. It actually, when the carburetor does its thing right, it's actually vaporizing, atomizing the fuel, putting a bunch of little particles into the air, and that can allow that to turn into a vapor. So that way, when it gets compressed, it can go boom. Because we know from what we learned in science class, liquids cannot be compressed. Not very well without more damage happening. So you want your fuel to be a vapor when it goes in there. Well, gasoline becomes a vapor at very, very low temperatures. So you don't have to worry about that. Kerosene, on the other hand, it is a lot higher temperature for it to become a vapor, which is why all those old kerosene tractors would start on diesel, or would start on gas. Would start on gas, because gas would run at that lower when it's cold, and then it would heat up, and it would get hotter. You'd switch it over to kerosene, and then you'd run on kerosene all day once it was hot. So that's why you would see stuff, and even like this M, its intake manifold. We're gonna do a whole thing on, because I got a propane manifold for this tractor, so we're gonna go through all that science works. These manifolds were basically, the exhaust and the intake would be off the same casting, and they would have heat shields, and they have things in the radiator, so these engines would run warm, so that way when the kerosene came in, it would vaporize correctly. And that's also why a lot of those older tractors, like if you know on these M's, they have the two dipsticks, because when they would run the not gas fuel, they were more likely to have some run past the reins and not burn efficiently and end up in the oil, which is what you don't want. So again, very basic. And still in the time, and the other problem with kerosene is it's like 30 to 40 octane, and those early gases were 50, 60, something like that. We'll get into what 70 octane was. It's obviously with the Oliver 70 in a little bit. So they were a lower, they were such a lower octane, they run lower compression, which, yes, if you guys know how engines work, the lower your compression, the less power you're going to make for the same cubic inch size. If you raise your compression up with the same cubic inch, you're going to make more power because you're compressing that more, and it makes more boom booms. Science. But the nice part was, with the lower compression ratios on some of these engines, when these were before the time of electric starts, when they were hand crank, it was a whole lot easier to turn over something that was 4-to-1 than something that's like 9-to-1. And if you guys ever turned an engine over with the heads on and the spark plugs in and everything all sealed up, you'll know that the higher the compression, the harder it is to turn over, because you're having to compress that air. It takes more to compress that air. And obviously, it's a good thing when it's running. So, and all these old tractors, they were all hand start. They didn't have electric start until, we'll do a video on that. But they didn't have, so that was all, it was another nice part about these lower grades. It was cheaper because gasoline at that time, I mean, to do this distillation process to make the fuels is very expensive. And that's why, I mean, we think about now where, you know, you just go to every 3 blocks to the gas station, you read about the early time period, and there was, you know, there was a time where people were buying gas at, like you'd go buy like a pail of gas, not a pail, but like a container of gas at like the drugstore. I mean, it wasn't as, you know, what we have now. So kerosene was a lot cheaper, so for farmers it worked out much better. Well, even cheaper than kerosene in the big scale thing was something called distillate, which distillate goes back to that process we talked about with the distillation. It's in the name. So as you're, you know, imagine you got this big pot on your stove, and you got like a nozzle on it that's, you know, for letting, and you have different containers. And when it, you know, at 100 degrees, the stuff you're cooking, let's say, and that's not real numbers, no real numbers here. Methane, which is actually C1, which is the lightest of all of them, comes out. So you will get it up to that temperature. Once it gets to that temperature, you'll want to make sure it's putting that out. Well, you'll get what you think is almost all of that out. Then you're going to heat it up more. Well, while you're going through that crossover period, you're still going to be boiling things off because it's what's happening, but it's not pure the next gas, which I think is, I don't know, it's some other gas. You can tell me in the description. I know it, but I'll show you. It's no notes. I'm just trying to do it off the old thinker. Anyway, so while they're in between those cycles and those temperatures until you have a pure gas coming out that you want, you will have this extra stuff. So you just kind of dump that over there, come back, come out, get the next stuff. That ends up being distillate. Distillate's approximately 30 to 40 octane level, which is, again, so give you that lower compression ratio in all the distillate tractors. An octane level, for those, basically it's the amount of its resistance to detonation. So if you can always run a higher octane on lower compression, you can't run a lower octane on higher compression, because at the resistance to detonation, if it's a low compression, doesn't matter. It will burn. You can put too much octane at something and make it lose power because of the speed of flame and all that science. But if you try to run a high octane engine on this disgusting 30 to 40 octane fuel, it would just destroy itself and knock and die, because essentially what would happen is, as that piston was coming up, the heat, it would basically self-ignite. When it would get as the compression, because as you compress, it would get hotter and hotter and hotter. It would get to a point where it goes boom on its own, and it would auto-ignite, as they say, and that causes detonation because your piston's not all the way up. And if your piston's not all the way up basically top dead center, when the fire happens, it'll force it down when the rest of the engine is trying to push it back up, and that's how you hear that knock. It goes dunk, 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 and it's bad times by all. So that was distillate. So distillate came out, again, it was a way cheaper fuel. So, and it was readily available because it was in all these ways they were doing it. How they were making fuel at the time, it was a byproduct. So the oil companies could sell a byproduct, and so the industry made these tractors. And so you'll see like John Deere's that are like called all fuel, that they can run on distillate. The Farmalls with the if they have the starting tank would run on distillate. Depending on your head too, would tell you what head, and they were all really low compression. They still were similar in power. They would be down on power a little bit, but the advantage is in today's time you can throw whatever fuel in it and it's going to be fine because you're so low compression. But so that was, and why you don't see distillate anymore isn't because there's no modern engine that could run on something that was, or there's no modern engine with that low compression from the factory. Maybe when they're all clapped out. But the main issue is, and there's no modern engine that can run 30 octanes. They're all way higher now. Is during World War II, they changed how they made fuel. Basically, the distillate, obviously when they would distill the fuel and make all the different fuels, you had a set number of, when you had a 55-gallon barrel of crude oil, it would make this much this gas, this much this gas, this much this gas, this much this gas. Well, by the time World War II came around, if we had 55 gallons of crude, we needed to make that all into gas. So for the war effort, we couldn't have all these other gases that, yeah, we'd use them in things, but we didn't need all of them. So that's when they came up with cracking. They call it cracking gas, which I'm sure my dad used a bunch, so if he's watching this, he'll be like, ha, you're saying all the wrong things. Of course I am. But basically, cracking, they use, hey, cutting in the video here, because I realized watching through it that I said all of the cracking portion completely wrong. Well, so essentially when they figured out a crack gas, they would use a catalyst and they could separate the different types of gas without any byproducts. There wouldn't be that in-between time as they were changing temperatures. So that's why distillate was no longer made, and so that's why it was no longer a fuel, basically. So we'll cut you right back out in the garage. Thanks. Because of that process and because of what we had to do in World War II to make that, distillate was done. Now, during the same time, the other fuel we're going to talk about today, because like I said, we're not going to get into diesel because diesel came and then it's everything. LP, or propane, that's not even a good Hank Hill, I'm sorry. Anyway, propane came out. And the first tractor that I found that had propane, it would make sense because they all seemed to run it, was a 1941 Minneapolis Moline on the U, was the first tractor that had propane. Propane was good. And had some advantages and disadvantages. Again, it was in the distillation process, it was a lot lighter gas. And so it was always getting produced. And so in areas, they said, especially in areas, and this is why you see a lot more propane powered stuff down south, because in that process, it was kind of considered at the time to not be as useful as gas. So if you could find a use for it, fine and dandy. The difference, you can't just like pour propane into a tank like this. It's got to be a sealed tank like what you have on your grill that's bigger. the advantage is it's what they call a dry fuel, and a dry fuel, a dry fuel burns cleaner, and it doesn't. It's not necessarily that like they both burn. It's just not any extra junk with it. So because it's a dry fuel, your valves stay cleaner. You have less carbon. They run better. The disadvantage with them is technically propane is it's lower power per pound than gasoline. So to make up for it, because propane is also a much higher octane, between 104 and 110, depending on your blend, you could run a higher compression. So in that Minneapolis U, the propane from the factory was like 6.8 versus the gas version, it was like a 5.6. So they were making up their loss of power by with the higher compression. A lot of guys at that time in the late 40s and 50s when propane blew up, respectively, they were converting gasoline tractors into propane because it was cheaper in their area to run. It was, but you can make a gas engine run on propane. You're just not going to get all the advantages because you're going to get a little bit worse economy because you're not going to have that higher compression unless you do other engine mods. But propane was great. I mean, obviously we still have propane stuff out there today because it burns so much cleaner. You can run it they can run it inside better. I mean, still not like, don't be taking a hit off the pipe, but so you see it in indoor things. You see it in quite a few vehicles. I think I was reading some of my research. They were saying there's like 150,000 vehicles on the road that are propane powered, or it might have been liquid propane, which is a different thing. We'll get to that. Actually, we won't get into that. Screw that. It's way more science than I have time for. But the propane, it was popular until diesel really took over. The last Minneapolis Moline propane was like the G955 and the G1355, which is also like the last Minneapolis Moline tractors before they became all white. But at that point, the writing was kind of on the wall. Diesel was going to be where it was at. Turbocharging diesel, there was more advantages with it, and it worked better. And that's what was basically, it's what you see everything is now in the farm industry, because it made more sense and it can make more power for smaller cubic inches because it was all these good things. And we can get into diesel later, but I thought it was interesting to look at some of these old fuels and why there were certain fuels that we had, like distillate in Europe was called tractor vaporizing oil. Wasn't called the fuel, it was tractor vaporizing oil, which is basically distillate, same thing. Because it's all based off of oil, I mean, so that's where it's all from. But just how they ran different things. And that's why, your older stuff, and the advantage is everything kind of works itself out where, these old distillate tractors, they say if you want to run something that's similar to what distillate is, it'd be like half kerosene, half gasoline, somewhere in the middle there. But I just think it's kind of interesting during that, first 50 years of tractors really becoming popular, there was a lot of varieties of fuels versus now you don't really have much. I mean, if it's a very small thing, it might be gasoline, but even most small things are diesel now. So, there's not really options versus, it used to be because even when like this farm oil was made, there was still a diesel option, which is a whole nother thing on how that worked. But, you had, and there was no LPMs. The only LP would have been the 450. Because again, Minneapolis Moline came out with it, and then everyone kind of came out with it later. And the main disadvantage for LPs is that, and I'm sorry to offend people, they're all ugly. There's not one LP tractor that looks somewhat decent. Maybe one that if the tank was behind you, but they all have these big ugly tanks everywhere. Like the one here, it's like boom here, and Oliver, it ruins the whole lines. And John Deere New Generations, it sticks up on the end because who needs to see in front of you? There was ones that they had to intermingle better, but a lot of times they're not. The minis, I will say, acquired taste. Just kidding. But they were somewhat blended in, mostly because they were behind it first. Another nice thing about propane, and I heard this at the Rand Tool Show a few years ago, a little sidebar, a little bonus facts. You can't siphon off someone's propane, if you think about it. If you left your tractor out in the field and some dirty vagrant came and siphoned all your fuel out, you'd be done. Well, if a guy tried to siphon your propane off, he probably wouldn't end up so well. So that was that. But interesting nonetheless. Again, let me know in the description what you guys want to know for the next what's the deal with. I know we're going to do one on these things right here, electrical lights. That's going to be an interesting one. And I guess we'll do one on starters, electric starting. That'd be fun. So tell me all the things I said wrong in the comments. like and subscribe. You all know what to do. More videos coming because obviously we got to show off how cool Glenn is. He's pretty cool. So we'll see you next one. Bye.